Luke Halpin first. Luke is the Lancaster LGBTQ+ Forum Faith Officer, and he will talk about life beyond the tick box. He will share experiences of the reality of living life when you fit in multiple boxes. So thank you, Luke, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Just let me start the sharing. Can everyone see that?
Yes, very well.
Fabulous. Right. So hi, welcome to my presentation on life beyond the tick box. I'm Luke. I've made this presentation with the help of the LGBTQ+ forum at Lancaster, where I am, as was pointed out, the faith welfare officer. Basically means I support people who identify as people of faith and who are LGBT. So let's get started. Yes, I spent too long on the slide transitions. So first, what's this all about? So for some of you who may or may not know what intersectionality is, it is basically where you have characteristics or identities that might fall into multiple groups or categories. So myself, for an example, I am gay, autistic, I have ADHD, and I'm a Catholic. So quite an intersectional personality there. But what difference does it actually make? Obviously, I'm a very interesting person because of it, but does it make any difference in day-to-day life? Unfortunately, yes. It often means life can actually be a bit harder. You can have multiple forms of ignorance or discrimination to combat and deal with on a daily basis. And it can even create barriers to taking part in things such as pride. For example, I have sensory issues. If things are too loud or chaotic, I struggle to take part because it becomes overwhelming. This is why it's important to be aware of these differences, making sure that things are open and accessible, not just to LGBTQ+ people, but everyone in our community, because more often than not, people aren't just LGBT, they have other attributes. Now, as a society, we are beginning to get a bit more inclusive, which is a good thing, and it shows that years and years of struggle and sacrifice and fighting for our rights are beginning to pay off. However, this hard-won inclusivity, to be effective and worth a shred of anything, we can't be leaving people out. Better situations and circumstances for members of our LGBT community should not cause other groups to be excluded, because they could be part of our community. So there's no point in making events or campaigns that are only accessible to a certain kind of person, because very few people are just one type of person. And by being aware of this, we can make sure our events are as inclusive as possible and make sure everyone in our community can take part. Now, the last bit is a bit more complicated. How can we make this difference? Seems like a short question, but can actually be quite complicated. How can you include everyone? How do we remember all these various combinations of identities and scenarios? For example, if you put me in charge of an event, how am I possibly going to be able to think of absolutely everything and everyone? The short answer is I'm not going to be able to do that, no matter how hard I try. Individuals have limits to their experiences and their capabilities. There's only so much one person can do. So thankfully, the answer to quite a complicated problem is actually quite simple. Talk to people. Not just one person, not just one group, as many people as you can find. Talk to people of faith, find out when their holy days are so that their events are on days that they can attend. Talk to people with accessibility requirements about how we can make sure events are accessible to them so they can be included. Maybe even talk to people who might not be native English speakers. Find out how we can make sure people who don't necessarily speak English can be included in the advertising and publicizing for events to make sure they can take part and attend. Doing all these things and talking to all these people is how we get them involved, and it's how we overcome the barriers that would prevent them from taking part. Right, next slide. So for this bit, I'm sharing someone's personal experience with you. I have anonymized them for their own privacy, and we're going to call them Steve. Yes, I'm very creative. So Steve was attending an event with an LGBT group not that long ago, maybe a few years. This event was meant to be an opportunity for people to go on a night out with LGBT people, so they knew they were surrounded by people like them, people who would be accepting and understanding, essentially making sure that the night out was a safe space. This trip did involve taking a bus. It did involve a bus journey, which was quite crowded, and people may or may not have been a bit tipsy. And then they ended up at a nightclub, which can be quite a noisy and overwhelming environment. This person did have sensory issues and was struggling. However, thankfully, this scenario ends happily. One of the organizers of the event had anticipated this and had earplugs for which they gave to this person so that they were able to enjoy it. However, if you play out the scenario where this didn't happen, the person may have experienced more and more sensory issues due to the chaos, may have struggled and started to feel very uncomfortable, and may have been put off attending future LGBT or Pride events because of this experience. We need to be aware of this kind of thing. So talking to people with sensory issues about how is best to deal with this. So for example, perhaps having quiet spaces. So if things are getting a bit much, they can go and rest or just have a bit of a escape for a minute. Next slide. Right. Now this scenario is a little bit more personal because it's about me, or well, people like me who are people of faith and LGBT. So the problem here is people can be left without a safe space. So as an example, I might go to a church that might be a bit less accepting of who I am, which is obviously not great. However, someone might say, okay, so we can just go to an LGBT safe space and we're fine there. Unless people already there have experienced severe discrimination or oppression from people who might use religion as an excuse for this horrendous behavior. Suddenly, my beliefs might make my being there might make certain people feel uncomfortable because of past experiences with people of faith, which honestly would make me quite uncomfortable, which means there's suddenly no real safe space for people who happen to fall into both of those groups. This scenario is actually part of the reason why I helped to create the faith stuff at the university, because the only real way I've thought of so far to try and help deal with this problem is help people see that it's fine, normal, and completely acceptable to be LGBT and to be a person of faith. So best way is try and let people see other people like them, see that they're having this overlap is completely normal and if nothing else, completely acceptable. And to continue improving this, we need to talk to both LGBT and people of faith to work out the best ways of bringing these groups together in a constructive way to make them both feel more accepting of each other and realize they probably have more in common than they have in difference. So what does all this actually mean? Well, obviously we're all different, even if we have many similarities. We need to remember to treat people as people, not just the characteristics they may happen to have. As part of the problem in society at the moment is that while being inclusive is great, the way they're doing this is by almost reducing people to tick boxes and criteria and characteristics and minorities. To be completely honest, I hate most of these phrases because they make us feel almost subhuman. What this means is people feel isolated, they feel alone, like they can't speak out, they're the voice of the minority, which, to be completely honest, I think is a load of rubbish. The idea that we are the minority is incomprehensible to me because there isn't a minority. I'm not just part of the LGBT community, I'm part of the disabled community, I'm part of the faith community, whether some of them want me there or not. So I'm not a minority because we are all part of a bigger thing. So while it means we shouldn't be, so what does this all mean? It means we shouldn't be treating people as characteristics. We shouldn't be treating them as tick boxes or protected groups or minorities. We should be treating people as, surprise, surprise, people, as who they are, not what they are. It shouldn't matter what we are. I shouldn't have to be able to point to a law to say that you should be treating me well because I have a certain characteristic. I should be able to just go about my day and be treated as I ask to be treated. We shouldn't be having to be pulling up all these characteristics and all these protections because treating each other. One second. Oh, right, there we go. Because treating each other as just a characteristic makes us feel divided and isolated and on our own, which is personally something I'm not a fan of. I want to be part of this brilliant community that celebrates our differences, and that's what we need to do, celebrate our differences, because we are all different, no matter how many similarities we have. You could, for example, I am a gay Catholic with autism and ADHD. You could go and find another gay Catholic with autism and ADHD, and we'd probably be completely different, because we are people, not characteristics. And we need to remember that when we have these discussions. It's why we need to get people together with intersectional identities, especially people who see things from different perspectives, so that we can celebrate these people and include them in how we can make our community and our events and our campaigns as inclusive as possible of everyone in our community, because that's the only way we can actually make progress. Thank you for attending and listening to me. If you have any questions for me that you're not comfortable in asking at the Q&A at the end of all the presentations, or if you need any support for any of the issues that I've talked about, you can email me there at l.halpin@lancaster.ac.uk, or you can contact the LGBTQ+ forum via Facebook or Instagram, and we can help you find some resources or other means of support. Hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations, and again, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Luke. That was really interesting. Thank you very much for your presentation. And as Luke said, there will be time at the end of the presentations for some questions and answers. I'll now move on to the next presentation from Emilia Kenton. Emilia will talk about being a person of color and a member of the LGBTQ+ community in academia. Emilia studies English literature and history, and he has a strong interest and research interest in EDI, racial equality, and representation in higher education. Emilia, if you are there, I'll leave the floor to you.
Hi. Yeah, sorry my camera's off. Not feeling great this morning, but we moved. So I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm quite bad at technology, but we'll get there. I'm sure it will be all right. So can you all see this okay? Is that all good? Is everything?
Yes, Emilia. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's see if I can click through. A little bit about me. My name is Emilia Kenton. I'm a second-year English literature and history student. This year I've been studying adaptations in media, as well as human rights and the history of early America. I myself am a mixed Black Caribbean and white English woman, and I identify as bisexual. So, June 1969, a month familiar with most of the LGBTQ+ community. Over a period of 5 days, the event now known as the Stonewall Riots revolutionized the community's story and trajectory, setting us on a course to where we are now. The figurehead? One Marsha P. Johnson. By throwing the first brick, Johnson has often been credited as bringing the face of change. As a woman of colour, knowing that this wonderful month that we celebrate was spearheaded by a Black drag queen has always been an inspiration. Without Marsha, this panel wouldn't be happening today. However, throughout history, LGBTQ+ people of colour have often been ignored or erased from their stories, be that in order to distance other issues from queerness or because of the systematic issues with intersectionality that have plagued society for years. So, to begin with, I'd like to take a look at the presentation of our community in modern media. When we Google top LGBT movies, a list at the top of the search page appears. If we were to take the first 7 to appear, currently these would be the movie Pride, Moonlight, Love, Simon, Call Me by Your Name, the half of it, Can You Ever Forgive Me, and Blue is the Warmest Colour. How many of these movies do you think had a person of colour as their protagonist? The only one so far in this list is Moonlight. A spoiler alert for Love, Simon here, so if you don't want to know, I'd cover your ears for the next 5 seconds. But the love interest is ultimately revealed to be a black man. The movie itself centers around the struggle of a cis white teenage male. Yes, these 7 movies are only a handful of LGBT movies that have been produced throughout history. But for a moment, I do want you to think, if I was to ask you what pieces of cinematic media first come to mind when I mention this topic, what would you say? Would you think of iconic love stories such as Brokeback Mountain, or biopics such as The Imitation Game or Rocket Man? I want you to think of where queer people of colour fit into your narrative. While yes, ultimately the highest box office grossing LGBT biopic of all time is centred around Freddie Mercury, a man of colour, was that one of your first thoughts? So I'll move away from movies for a moment, and I'll look at another form of media that we probably all like to engage in: television. For now, I'm going to speak about a more personal experience and basically talk about one of the first queer women of colour on a TV show that I watched. I'm going to preface this section by saying that I never actively went out of my way to look for shows that represented me as a person. Maybe if I had, the way that I view things would be perhaps different, but I didn't. And so for me, the first real visual representation that I saw that I could perhaps relate to was Miss Pusey Washington, the woman on the left of the circle that you see here, on Netflix, on the Netflix original TV series, Orange is the New Black. Now, Washington seemed like someone I could finally begin to see myself in, a woman of colour who was confident in her sexuality. But could she ever truly represent me? For a start, she was black. I am not a black woman. I identify as mixed race, 2 separate identities that face different challenges in today's climate. And secondly, Pusey is a lesbian. And as much as I appreciated this openness surrounding sexuality, you know, once again, this felt almost as strange to me as being straight would be. She was sure of who she was attracted to. She never questioned herself in that way that I had in terms of that. And finally, as much as I love her, she was a criminal living inside of a prison, something I've yet to experience. Since watching that show, I have seen other women of colour on TV who've struggled with their sexuality and their cultural identity, such as Rosa Diaz. She once again came to being close to being relatable, struggling with talking about her bisexuality, how that influenced her as a person, with her workmates. But once again, as Rosa is a Hispanic woman, I've never felt that I could truly understand her culture and how we would relate on that front. Now, back to Orange is the New Black. Pusey was never really questioned for being a lesbian, but was instead targeted because of her race. And once again, sorry for the spoilers. Her death, she was targeted because of her race, ultimately costing her life. Having seen Black people targeted disproportionately throughout history by police, watching Pusey's death was something that affected me profoundly. In a moment, a character that I had found comfort in had suddenly been taken away from me. I no longer had her presence on screen, and I no longer felt that I could see myself. Yes, in media, other queer or Black characters have been killed previously, but seeing the first woman that I felt so connected to be taken away so carelessly was something that I had never expected. I will admit that I felt a real sense of loss at the death of this character, something that I had only really felt once or twice before. But why am I talking to you about these specific examples? Well, I'll be honest with you. Prior to researching this topic, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head any story that focuses on a bisexual, biracial woman. I couldn't even tell you a character. Is this due to ignorance or due to a lack of available representation? I could perhaps tell you about literature surrounding the idea of being mixed race, such as Mixed Feelings by Avon Yogia, whose surname I can never pronounce, apologies. Or perhaps the most prominent example of mixed race media that I can name is the Blackish TV series and universe created by Kenya Barris. For those unfamiliar with the show, the character of Rainbow often struggles with her identity, feeling at odds with other characters on the show, and that she doesn't really fit in with people around her. But once again, she is a married straight woman, setting up a further disconnect between us. So it sort of seems that I've been rambling a lot about popular culture when I prefaced this talk, saying that I was going to talk about being a member of the LGBTQ plus community in academia. I know it was a pretty long opener, but it was important. Studying an English literature and history degree, the impact of the media on the academic fields I like to focus on is, frankly, humongous. And so, why then, when I study works throughout history, do I not see this intersectionality in a way that represents me or other people that I know? I would have assumed that in 2021, more inclusive and intersectional texts would be being studied, a reflection of the student body. But looking back at the compulsory literature course from this university, sadly, there was very little crossover. We studied Aphra Behns' Orinoco, which focused on race, Jackie Kay's Trumpet, which surrounded LGBTQ issues, and other texts perhaps surrounding feminism and my identity as a woman. However, once again, there is very little crossover. As a queer woman of colour, this led me to begin to question things and question myself. It seemed as though the idea of being bisexual and being biracial could not coexist. I could only be concerned about one aspect of my identity, and they would always be at odds with one another. When learning about queer theory, it would be focused on those LGBT parts of myself, with theory surrounding race, it would be the other. There were no overlaps, no interlocks, and quite frankly, it's rather damaging. I do understand that being both biracial and bisexual while also being a woman puts me in a small category of students, but it's still a category nonetheless. I know in this discussion we're hoping to break out of these categories, but just roll with the image for a second. If I were to be studied in a course, me as a person, perhaps people would not look at me as a whole with all of my identities intact. But in my opinion, queer theory and other racial theories must go hand in hand when looking at me as an intersect. My queerness has been affected by my race and how I choose to present myself. Other people will prejudge my race before they know my sexuality, and some who know my sexuality will disregard my identity of race. But ultimately, I am both and more. Will academics see me as such? If in modern pop culture I can barely find a picture of myself that I can understand and relate to, will others be able to? Academia and history itself has been tainted by this erasure. In one course that I was part of, language that was used was not only dehumanizing on a massive historical scale, but reminded me as how I was seen by many. I won't use the language that they did. I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable here. But despite complaints, this language was still used. With that aspect of my own identity spoken down on, it made me question how people refuse to view our demographic often as people, despite claiming to be progressive. And it reminded me of one man who was forced to choose between his sexuality and advancing racial rights in the civil rights era. And that man was Mr. Bayard Rustin. If you are unaware of who this man was, Rustin was a close friend of Martin Luther King Jr., helping to organize his most iconic I Have a Dream speech, fighting for Black civil rights. However, Bayard himself was a gay man, and many people threatened to make up rumors about him and King Jr. in order to derail the civil rights movement. Bayard was forced to choose between being openly gay and helping progress racial equality. Ultimately, he was posthumously celebrated by Barack Obama, but obviously, past his death in life, he was never appreciated to that extent. It is this example of Bayard Rustin that will always act as a reminder to me that no person is comprised of one singular identity. Throughout history and throughout academics, I am more than just a woman of colour. I am more than just a bisexual woman. Those parts of my identity come together to form who I am, And as academics, we really do need to do better. We need to better represent those groups who have not been seen before, and we need to look at text and culture with a wider scope. We need to stop looking at things from one angle and be intersectional and be proud of who we are. That's what I've really got. So thank you very much for listening to what I have to say. So yeah.
Thank you, Emilia. That was really an incredible presentation. I personally didn't know about Rustin, so I'm sure there will be a lot of Q&A around what you said, what you talked about. I'm now going to give some time to Ruth and to prepare a PowerPoint. Ruth will talk about EDI initiatives in the English and Creative Writing Department. I can see you, Ruth. Hi. Sorry. And she's studying literary studies, and her interest in EDI comes from the fact that Ruth has done research on gender, and she has had experiences as a dyslexic student. So she will talk about how all these characteristics intersect at university, really. If you're ready, Ruth, I'll leave the floor to you.
Yes, thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you very much. I just want to double check that everyone can see the slides before I start.
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So, hi everyone, as Giuseppe kindly said, my name's Ruth Ann. My pronouns are she, her, and today I'm going to be speaking about some of the recent EDI initiatives at Lancaster University in the English Literature and Creative Writing Department. As I'm going to be focusing more on kind of our group initiatives, I just want to introduce myself a little bit first. So I'm currently an MA student in Literary Studies, having just finished my BA last academic year. As Giuseppe kindly introduced, so my primary area of research is in the intersections between literature, religion and the Gothic in 18th and 19th centuries, which may not sound as interesting to a lot of people, but it certainly is for me. And I've also worked on a lot of research around gender, so including a paper on Me Too and digital feminism that used tweets as literature. Is a kind of new digital humanities project, and also an upcoming paper on the Victorian writer Amy Levy and her navigation of gendered space at the Engendered conference this August. If you're interested in that, let me know and I can send you the link. Amy Levy is a fascinating person. She was, we think, though we don't know, but a queer Jewish woman writing in the 19th century and kind of just blowing all of these norms up, which was fascinating. I was also the digital accessibility officer for our department for a little while, so I've worked on creating accessible digital content, especially post-pandemic, and this involved kind of drawing on my experiences as a dyslexic student. Also, just to kind of, I guess, contextualize who I am in with our other panelists. So I am a cis white straight woman, so I recognise my privileges there. I'm also Catholic, I am also dyslexic, and I have been discriminated on my face again as a woman and in other ways too, excuse me, and in other ways as well. So as the focus of today's panel is on intersectionality, I will be focusing on some of the problems around equality, diversity and inclusivity as an agenda within the context of my department's work. So just click through. There we go. So there are going to be three main areas that I'm going to be focusing on today. The first is the creation of our department's EDI committee and how we came to be in the roles that we are as student representatives. And then moving on to a case study of our initiatives using the EDI suggestion box that we set up. And then finally, speaking a little bit about our upcoming student-led conference. Please excuse me while I'm reading my notes. As I mentioned, the dyslexia just means I need them in front of me. So the EDI committee in the English Literature and Creative Writing Department started as an action point from our Athena Swan Award. For those who don't know, Athena Swan is a gender equality charter for higher education institutions, and our department was awarded bronze in 2019. Following the award, the department founded its first EDI committee of 2019 to 2020 in that academic year. And we identified some issues and we're working around implementing individual learning support plans, which at Lancaster are commonly known as ILSPs, and the lack of diversity in our primary and secondary reading lists, which is an ongoing project, but there were particular concerns that were raised in our first year. And it's only continued to grow from there. So in our second year, we now have a dedicated EDI director who liaises with other EDI committees at a faculty and university-wide level. We've also grown in size from 12 to 15 members, and with it, our student representation has more than doubled to 7 from the original 3. So in this, I wanted to discuss some of the challenges that we've faced as student reps along the way. Firstly, we had to go through an application process for our positions. So we all sent a short paragraph to the EDI director about our motivations for wanting to join the committee. And while this is fantastic in a lot of ways, because it's meant that we've had a highly dedicated team throughout the year who've all got investments in EDI in different ways, it also meant that there were more applications than there were positions. So I think we've all held this knowledge that we're in quite a privileged post, that there's only 7 of us representing an entire student cohort, so that's quite a big responsibility to hold. Secondly, the application process meant that we, as those 7 student reps, were chosen partly because we represent a diverse group of people. And this was a vital aspect because it meant that there were new and previously unheard voices on our committee that we hadn't had before. And while it also led to differing opinions between us as representatives, given that each of us has a different approach to EDI coming from our multiple perspectives, it's also created new links between those areas of representation that we might previously have left unnoted. However, again, there was a conscious awareness, I think, from early in the year that as a small group, we didn't represent everyone and we couldn't represent everyone. We were only a group of 7 students volunteering our time. But in having these conversations and in having that open dialogue, it's how we start to address these issues. Thirdly, we have spent a lot of time this year trying to figure out where we fit into the system. So as new EDI focus groups pop up and evolve across the university, we've had to find our place amongst other departmental and faculty-wide reps, along with our lecturers and the various positions they hold. And because of the evolving nature of this, I don't think it's something that any of us will ever finish to kind of find some resolution of where we sit in the system, but it's an extra challenge that we've continued to face. And because of these numerous systems, we wanted to help our fellow students to know where they could go if we had any issues. So one of the first things we did was to set up these graphics on the department's Instagram page. And it helped put names to faces for everyone. You'll recognise Amelia there from previously as one of our reps. And this kind of helped foreground the student presence on the committee and helped signpost people to know where to go. We each wrote a short paragraph about our interests in EDI, and you can read these on our conference website that I'll be sharing a little bit later. One of our main initiatives from early in the year was the launch of the EDI suggestion box. This was quite easy to set up, as it was a Microsoft Forms, which everyone in the university has access to, and we shared the link on our department's Moodle page. All the submissions were anonymous, and it meant that all students in the department could send us their ideas or concerns and help us address that previously identified challenge of representing persons beyond our committee. And in doing this, we made sure that those suggestions were the driving force of our actions on the committee. So each committee meeting, we have a little item labelled student rep items, and that's kind of where we bring in all the suggestions that we've had. So following on from this, I want to draw attention to one particular case study, and it's something that Amelia has already mentioned as an English literature student. So in the second term, the first year students on the English 100 module teach and study Jackie Kay's Trumpet. First published in 1998, it recalls the life and death of fictional jazz artist Josh Moody and heavily features transgender themes. There was a bit of a coincidental coalition here, as we just sent out a reminder about the EDI suggestion box the week that the English 100 module was teaching this text. We then got numerous responses from students about the teaching of this text, including some snippets I've featured here on screen. We then alerted the department to these complaints, who'd also received some through their general email inbox, and we wrote a report containing the comments we'd received, along with our recommendations for going forwards. We also highlighted that, as Amelia said, and as I would have said as well, these are issues that probably should have been highlighted earlier, but due to the strikes over the last few years and then the pandemic, they weren't kind of highlighted sooner because this is a text that hasn't been taught for a couple of years. So it's kind of been brewing for a little while, and this year it kind of really came to the fore. The general sentiments across the comments this year that it wasn't the text itself, but the teaching of it. Placing Kay's book in context, it was published the same year that I was born. So it's as a text and as a critical materials that surround it, it's quite outdated by our current standards. However, simply taking it off the reading list risks shying away from those vital conversations and identifying it as what was once as what was once groundbreaking is now very problematic in lots of ways. So the result from this report was the development from our department of a course called Teaching Difficult Texts, which our tutors have been on, and they're collaborating, to my knowledge, with the history department as well, to start to address these issues from kind of a teaching level. Along with that, we had a letter published from the department to the first year students apologising for any issues and kind of upset that they caused, and an explanation of the action plan going forwards. It might not have necessarily fixed the issue, but it certainly started to address it. And personally, I couldn't help but smile, because the fact that first year students had the confidence and eloquence to raise their concerns with such volume and impact demonstrated the culture I hope that we continue to cultivate at the department. And it equally showed that the system is in part starting to work, because when there are EDI issues that students feel they need to raise, they know where they need to come. So moving away from kind of the EDI suggestion box for a second, and to end my talk today, I want to speak about the upcoming EDI conference that we've been organising. And I've included the website and Twitter details on screen if you want to stay up to date with our work. One of the central questions we've been asked since we announced the conference back in March was why Beyond 6 Characteristics is the name of the conference, and why 6 specifically? To answer this and our motivations behind the conference, I want to talk a little bit more about why we chose this name and why EDI and sectionality become more and more problematic the more we've looked into it. When I say the phrase protected characteristics, your mind probably goes to the 2010 Equality Act, which lists 9 groups protected under the law. However, as you'll see on screen, the answer to what those protected characteristics are varies depending on when and where you look. For example, the precursor to the 2010 Act in 2006 only listed 7 groups, while in EU law we have up to 13. Furthermore, which characteristics the equality laws cover is constantly fluctuating, making it difficult to discern whose rights matter in the present moment. So again, you can see between these lists that there are quite significant variations. And to give an example from kind of closer to home, looking at Lancaster's EDI policies. So in the actual written document, the EDI policy, it lists the 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act of 2010. However, in the EDI goals and objectives and the reports that we see each year, one of the main things that we're looking at is the gender pay gap. However, you'll notice that on the Equality Act of 2010, gender isn't on there. It's classified normally under sex, which is problematic because then we have sex as one category, gender reassignment as another. So whose rights are we looking at when we're talking about the gender pay gap? It's a small semantic difference, and it shows that hangover from the 2006 iteration of the Equality Act, where gender was a protected characteristic. So it's interesting to see how these semantics are changing around the protected characteristics, and also which ones we're still focusing on and which ones we perhaps aren't as much. Equally, just going back to the origins of why 6, and it reverts to the 6 laws that merged together to form the Equality Act. So within these laws, there are further subcategories that we don't quite see on the surface, some of which were later included in the Equality Act and some of which weren't. I've also included an example from a 2017 survey from Ofcom, which was about equal opportunities in the TV industry here in the UK. And quite concerningly, it lists 3 mandatory categories for the survey participants to answer to, and 3 optional ones when monitoring diversity. And here it demonstrates the lasting impact of that number 6 when we're talking about equality. And it also gives a concerning, again, insight into the priorities of organisations who are talking about the need for protection from discrimination. I've included all of these various lists from the characteristics from different countries, organisations and times because they represent a fundamental problem when we're talking about EDI in equality law. Who is protected can and does change, and so saying protected characteristics is merely a summative statement. The same is true of EDI. It signifies equality, diversity and inclusivity, but it doesn't denote what that agenda serves and to what end as well. It's here that intersectionality becomes something so prevalent because it's essential for listening to others when they say, my rights need protecting, my rights need representation. And it also recognises that those protected characteristics are limited, are reductive and problematic in a multitude of ways. In asking what the protected characteristics and by extension what EDI means, we need to recognise a need to push beyond what the legal procedure mandates, to push beyond what we consider must need protecting and who we should protect in that as well. Even further than this, we also need to move from the idea of protection to celebrating, to valuing, and to, for want of a better word and coming from my Christian background, for loving people for the characteristics they have. The purpose of this EDI conference then is to examine and move beyond these protected characteristics, and part of this comes from creating an inclusive academic environment. So, some feedback from our undergraduate EDI reps reveals that the academic conference format felt too formal for those just beginning their research journeys. So we plan to include an open mic night into our proceedings, which will hopefully encourage some of our creative students to get involved. We're also going to be holding conversation circles, which are kind of like informal seminars where you have one person leading and you go into breakout rooms and kind of share your ideas together. And this is to ensure everybody has the opportunity to share their ideas if they wish to. We're also delighted to be welcoming some fantastic international keynote speakers and panelists, ranging from, we've got some from Brazil and Germany and Canada. We're very excited, and that will hopefully give some diverse perspectives on EDI in more ways than one. Another significant consideration we're still facing is how to create a safe space for these discussions online, as many of the topics our panelists will address, as they have today, come from a very personal standpoint. So in the process of drafting a comprehensive code of conduct, we're trying to find ways to support our presenters and attendees alike. And I think that's just about all I have time for. So thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to ask any questions at the end or email me if you would like to. And I hope these EDI initiatives will help you in some way or another. Thank you.